Well, we come to lesson 12, the final lesson in Job, but we're not in the book of Job so much as in James. James chapter 5 and verse 11. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, or perhaps in some translations, you have heard of the patience of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. The steadfastness or the patience of Job. Now, let's put this in a context. James is speaking in verses 7 through 12 of the need for patience in suffering. Suffering is a big part of the book of James. He began right in chapter 1 and verse 2, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds. And now, here in the closing section, he's going to talk about trials and suffering again. For example, in verse 10, he says, in chapter 5 and verse 10, as an example of suffering and patience. So he's brought the whole argument, as it were, round again to suffering. Begins and ends the book with suffering and trials, and the need now to be patient, the need to be steadfast. He mentions, by way of example, the prophets in verse 10, who spoke in the name of the Lord. The prophets knew a great deal about trials, suffering. Think of the opposition that Jeremiah experienced. Think of the bereavement that Ezekiel experienced, wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. Think of the marital issues that Hosea, the prophet, endured, and so on. The prophets knew all about trials and suffering. But his prime example here that he mentions by name is Job. You've heard of the steadfastness or the patience of Job. What does James mean when he talks about the steadfastness of Job or the patience of Job? Now, there's one sense in which, as we've been studying the book of Job together, we might draw the conclusion Job wasn't a patient man. There are certainly moments in the book of Job, chapter 3, when he descends into that great darkness. His reaction to the three friends, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and so on, and there were certainly times when he seemed to lose patience with them, when he chastised them, when he appealed to them for mercy and they didn't show any mercy. There are even times, I think, in the book of Job where Job seems to lose patience with God, with God's providence. So what does James mean by raising him now to this pinnacle, this standard of patience and steadfastness? And I think it's the emphasis on steadfastness rather than the narrower thought of patience, as we sometimes think of the word patience, that is in view. Let me use a different word. It's a word that's perfectly compatible with the word that James is using. Stickability. And then I think the British say stick-to-itiveness. Or is it the other way around? I forget after a while. Stickability and stick-to-itiveness. He keeps on going. That's what you get from Job. Even in the darkest moments, even in the thick of the trial, even when the clouds seemed to descend and blackness seemed to pervade, he still kept on going. Let me flesh that out a little. What lessons have we learnt from the book of Job? Using steadfastness of Job as an entry point into the whole book of Job. What have we learnt? Well, I think first of all, Job expressed his steadfastness in his belief in the sovereignty of God. God is sovereign. There are certainly times in the book of Job when Job seems to begin to question perhaps the love of God, and the love of God for him in particular, but he never questions the sovereignty of God. God is in control. He orders the end from the beginning. His doctrine of providence, we might say. Why do things happen? Why are things the way that they are? Because God orders them. He has the finger on the button, as it were. Things fall out because God decrees it to happen. That's not to say, and remember in the Westminster Confession, for example, the Puritans of the 17th century, and they're simply reflecting the theology of the Reformers, and they're simply reflecting the theology of actually medieval theologians, that there are first causes and second causes. God permits certain things to happen, for example. But nothing happens outside of God's decree. God is not surprised by anything. God doesn't have that, aha moment, as if he never saw this coming. Things happen because God orders them to happen. He wills them to happen. And he wills them to happen in the way that they happen, and he wills them to happen before they happen. That's the only basis upon which we can say God works all things together for our good. Not just the good things, all things. The bad things, the trials. Yes, the horrendous loss of 10 children in one day. The collapse of your pension account, your 401k. The stock market just goes through the floor, and all your savings are gone. And you're bankrupt. The loss of your health. And many people say, if you have your health, you have everything. Well, that's not true. But health is an important aspect, and it affects everything about us. And you lose your health, and very often other things go with it too. And questions where you are, and spiritually, and so on. And so here is James saying, you've heard of the steadfastness of Job. Job maintained his steadfastness in his belief in the sovereignty of God. William Cowper's great hymn, we cited it in a previous lesson. God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. The problem about planting your footsteps in the sea is that you can't see them. The problem about riding in a storm is that you can't see the person coming. All you see is the storm. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. And so on. So that, first of all, he maintained his steadfastness in his belief in the sovereignty of God. We've been addressing the issue of theodicy, the justification of God in the face of evil. We've been discussing the problem of pain. It's central to the book of Job. But no explanation of theodicy, no explanation of the problem of pain is adequate, apart from the consideration of God's sovereignty. It raises difficulties. It raises some very complicated philosophical questions. It raises the whole issue of compatibilism, for example, in providence. It's a word for you to look up. People still discuss it. They'll still be discussing it when Jesus comes again, because they've always been discussing this relationship between good and evil, sovereignty of God, and the existence of evil in the universe. And how is it that God is not the author of evil, and so on? That he creates a universe in which sin is possible. Well, Job maintained his steadfastness in the sovereignty of God. The second thing I think we see in Job is his steadfastness in faith. His steadfastness in faith. When Job is angry, whom does he take that anger out on? Well, the friends for sure, but he also takes out his anger on God. He doesn't become an atheist. He talks to God. He brings his complaint. He brings his argument. He brings his plea. He brings his cries when he feels sorry for himself. Remember that passage where we looked at Job and he said, you'll be sorry when I'm gone. Who's he talking to? Well, he's talking to God. Even in his despair, even in his blackest moments, in his darkest moments, he's still talking to God. His belief in God never wavered. He didn't become an atheist. There's a wonderful hymn. It's taped in the back of my Bible. I've loved this hymn ever since I first came across it. It's not sung in church very much anymore. I'm not sure why. It's by John Newton, the great 18th century Puritan preacher, author of Amazing Grace and so on. I asked the Lord that I might grow in faith and love and every grace, might more of his salvation know and seek more earnestly his face. Who hasn't done that from time to time? Lord, I want to grow. I want to mature in the faith. I want to be strong in the Lord. I want great faith. I've got weak faith. I want great faith. Give me great faith. What does it mean? How is God going to answer that prayer? Be careful what you pray for. God might answer it. 'Twas he who taught me thus to pray, and he, I trust, has answered prayer. But it has been in such a way as almost drove me to despair. I hoped that in some favored hour at once he'd answer my request, and by his love's constraining power subdue my sins and give me rest. He thought God would make him grow by giving him a peaceful, quiet life in a house in Florida, enjoying the fruit of one's labors in retirement, spending the inheritance. Instead of this, he made me feel the hidden evils of my heart and let the angry powers of hell assault my soul in every part. This is the book of Job. Yea, more, with his own hand he seemed intent to aggravate my woe. Crossed all my fair designs I schemed, blasted my gourds, things that shade me, and laid me low. Lord, why is this? I trembling cried. Wilt thou pursue thy worm to death? 'Tis in this way, the Lord replied, I answer prayer for grace and faith. These inward trials I employ from self and pride to set thee free and break thy schemes of earthly joy, that thou mayest find thy all in me. Well, that's a very famous poem by John Newton, but it almost summarizes the book of Job. He blasted his gourds. He laid him low. He let the angry powers of hell assault him in every part. And why? To grow him. Job, at the end of the book, laying his hand upon his mouth, I had heard thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. He'd grown in his understanding of who God is. He'd grown in faith. He'd grown in his dependence upon the Lord. Where is Job at the end of the book? Does he have the answer to all of the problems of suffering? Does he have an explanation for theodicy? Could he write a book on theodicy, explaining the relationship between God and sin and evil? No. At the end of the book, he's saying, well, in answer to the question, why Behemoth and why Leviathan? Why is there a crocodile in the world? I don't know. But it's not important that I know. What's important is that he knows. And I trust him. I trust him. I lean upon him. I look to him. I leave it with him. I sense this quietness, this ease, this rest that comes from casting all of it upon the Lord. Well, he learnt the steadfastness, and he expressed his steadfastness in ongoing faith. A third thing, You've heard of the steadfastness of Job. Job learnt that we ought not to be surprised or baffled by what God is doing. At the end of the book, I think that's where Job is. He's not surprised anymore. He's not baffled anymore. I wonder if, as a Christian, you think there are some things, that are beyond you because you're a Christian. The ungodly suffer these things, but Christians, God will never allow a Christian to suffer this particular trial, this particular malady. Job learned to see who he was. He learned to see himself as a creature, as someone created by God, as a very small thing, in fact. He laid his hand upon his mouth. He learned to see that he had no right to know, no right to understand, no right that God should reveal to him the purpose that lay behind every single event that befell him. He learned to express this steadfastness along the lines that, Isaiah 55 speaks. When it is said of God, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. Even Moses, Moses was shown a lot of things. Moses was shown into an inner chamber. He was shown something of the glory of God. God came to him in a powerful form, fiery form. God showed him so much of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And yet Moses testifies in Deuteronomy 32:32, the secret things belong unto the Lord. Those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children. There are things that I know, Moses could say. There are things that I've seen. There are things that I have heard. But there are secret things. There are unfathomable things. There are hidden things. Martin Luther, the Reformer, spoke of the Deus absconditus and the Deus revelatus. The revealed God, the hidden God. There's the God who is revealed. And then there's the God who is hidden. Hidden behind an inscrutable providence. Hidden behind unfathomable trials and difficulties. Job has learnt that. We shouldn't be surprised then or baffled by what God is doing. Job didn't know about Satan. It isn't clear to me right at the end of the book that he still knows anything about Satan. It isn't clear to me how many saints in the Old Testament since Job knew anything about Satan. There's not much about Satan in the Old Testament. Satan obviously plays a part. There are intimations in the book of Zechariah, for example, about the rebellion in heaven and so on. Satanic forces beyond our imagination, beyond our ability to comprehend. Not just the demons, but Satan himself, who must come in person to tempt the Lord Jesus. Most of us have never encountered Satan. We've encountered one of his interns. That'll do us fine. He doesn't have to come in person to the likes of you and me. But he came in person here. Took Job, as it were, on as a personal case. Grabbed hold of that file that had Job's name written on it, attempting to get Job to curse God. Job never cursed him. He was angry, he was frustrated. He demanded, he huffed and puffed, and we understand it. We want to be compassionate. We understand all of that in Job. He still needed to repent of it at the end of the book, but he never cursed God. Satan didn't win. The wager that Satan lays down at the beginning. Take away everything that he has and he will curse you to your face. Well, he didn't do that. I don't know about you, I find that extraordinarily comforting. He can keep you. You don't know how you're going to react if trouble comes. When you get that phone call and it's cancer, and it's in stage 3 or 4 or something, and then all of a sudden your life is just taken from you, and you're swimming in a sea of stuff that you never thought you'd be reading and trying to understand, and about possible cures and all the rest of it. And God can keep you. You're not surprised. You're not taken aback that such a thing should befall a Christian, a believer, because it befell Job. Job didn't know about Satan, but he refused to curse God. He persevered. Yes, the steadfastness of Job, even in the face of, the opposition of Satan. The opposition that is against you and me is greater than you imagine. It's not simply blind forces of providence. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. Well, there's a fourth thing I want us, to think about, and that is, we're thinking about the steadfastness of Job. What does James mean? And I think in part it means this. It's possible to survive in a trial of this magnitude. It's possible to survive. It's possible even to flourish. How wonderful that the book ends in such a positive way. As I was saying last time, it doesn't mean that that's going to be the case for every single Christian, that there's going to be a kind of happy ending. There'll ultimately be a happy ending in heaven. Heaven is a place of happiness and a place of joy. Everything will be resolved there, in a sense. But as you face, as in Columbia, South Carolina, where I live, and that morning when the floods came a few months ago and 13 trillion gallons of water burst out of a dam, out of a lake, and came down into a certain part of the city. And I've seen some of the pictures, I've seen some of the movies. I've seen pictures of people who were swept along, stories of a husband and wife and their 2 children swimming from their bedroom window over to the other side of the street in order to get away from this torrent of water. And they survived. They survived. They didn't survive. They say to me, they didn't survive through any ability of their own. They thought they were going to die. They look back and they say, Lord, thank you for keeping me. You kept me. What does Peter say? Kept through faith, ready to be revealed in the last time. Kept. Well, that's what I am in my trial, in my difficulty. God keeps me. He puts his hand around me and holds me and sometimes draws me to his breast. And he says to me, in the midst of the darkness, I will never let you go. I will never leave you nor forsake you, even in the darkness. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. Now, go and study this book all over again, starting in Job chapter 1 and verse 1. And the Lord bless you.